let's say if someone's in midlife in their 40s or 50s, and you were going to say one or two things for them to focus on, what would you say?
I'll give my top three. And the first one I'd start with would be friendship, and to culture friendship, how important that is. Maybe we can take a step back. You mentioned there that 80% is in our control. And isn't that wonderful? Because everybody assumes it's genes. You know, aging is about your genes, and you are stuck more or less at the moment anyway with whatever genes you've got. But that isn't the case. Genes only contribute to 20% of the aging process. 80% is within our control. So that's fantastic. And then what are the things that we know are in our control that influence the process, that influence that 80%? And so if my top three would be, as I said, friendship, having good friendships. It's not about quantity, but it's very much about the quality of relationships, quality of friendships. And we can come back to how that works later on. I'm sorry to say the next two, because once I said this on radio in Ireland, and the interviewer said to me, "Oh my God, not those old chestnuts again." But I have to mention diet, and I have to say exercise, because they are very important, and they are something that certainly definitely makes a difference. And then if I were to include a fourth, I'd say stress. How, stress is so bad for us. So anything that we can do to attenuate stress processes or attenuate stress itself is important for the aging process.
Yeah, brilliant. So friendships, well, let's broaden that out. I guess relationships, the food we're eating, how much we're moving our bodies, and how much stress we're being exposed to. We're going to get into all of those in detail.
Yeah.
But as you say, a lot of us who are health conscious these days have heard some of these messages, right? You have been publishing papers for years. You've been treating patients for years. You teach medical students. You've got a lot of experience. And I think everyone comes to the aging conversation at different times in their lives, right? So you mentioned your top three there, but I'm interested, how would you frame it differently depending on the age of someone who's coming to see you? So for example, if someone is a 40-year-old female, for example, how would you change that messaging slightly to be super relevant for them?
Good question. So 40-year-old female will be coming into menopause. So to be preparing for that, I would say that's the first thing. We can talk a little bit about that. It doesn't change what I'm saying about friendship, but it's sometimes much more difficult because there are an awful lot of other pressures on someone's life. So they don't have the time to be culturing friendships, etc. So, but to use some mechanism for retaining friendship is very important. You know, when you're picking up kids from school and having to do the housework piece and your work piece, that makes your life much more difficult in the context of diet, in the context of exercise. I can absolutely say that I almost came to a full stop when I was in that period of my life with my children and with my professional life, etc. All of the things that I'm going to be talking to you now about and your audience and sharing as being important for manipulating the aging process were almost at a full stop because I wasn't able to do everything and I focused on those other things. But I think it's not all or nothing. So at least to try and do some of the things we know are beneficial.
I mean, on that, that's really interesting. At this stage in your life now, with all the experience that you've got, with the knowledge you now have, if we rewind back to your 40s, had you known what you know now, do you think you would have been able to make different choices? Would you have made different choices back then?
Oh, that's such a great question. At a personal level, I probably wouldn't because I adore my work and obviously I love my family. But I in order to really focus on factors we just talked about, you really need to pull back from one or t'other. And I would not have done that at a personal level. I wouldn't have done it. However, I didn't know as much as I know now. And now that I know as much as I know, I'm working really hard on it, to be honest.
Well, that thing about work and purpose, of course, is something you've written a chapter on, which we're definitely going to talk about. So I get the messaging for a 40-year-old. If I was 70 years old talking to you saying, hey, listen, what can I do? How would your messaging change for, let's say, a 70-year-old?
Well, then the messaging is very different because generally speaking, we have more time. Although I've met a number of 70-year-olds who say, I've never been busier since they retired. Generally speaking, we have more time. And I think that there's a perception out there, societal perception, that as you get older, you shouldn't be doing as much. You should slow down. We don't expect as much of people. And I would love to see that concept changed because my advice would be do a little bit more every year. I definitely mean that applies to exercise. A little bit more, whatever your movement is that you enjoy, do a bit more each year after 50. But I would also recommend that in the context of food. Put a bit more variety into your food every year. Think of something different that you can do. But also creativity and purpose. Change that also every year of your life so that you have something that you want to do new every year. Variety on our plate and in our lives and in our exercise regime are really important. So I would say that applies. Can I say something about the age thing? 20-year-olds, this is important for. And that's the age I'd like to see starting to engage in the process. I was
going to come to that. And that's so far away.
Well, I have a great story about that because I was giving a lecture in Trinity recently and we've what's called a TEP course, which draws students from non-health related courses in the university into modules they might be interested in, and aging is one of them. So I had students from geography and law and mechanical engineering, etc., in the audience in front of me. And after the lecture, two young chaps came up and they were from Durham University on an Erasmus, Ben and Dominic. And they said that they were looking for the university to choose for their Erasmus. And they chose Trinity because of the longitudinal study on aging that was being done in Trinity. And I was like, just like you. Wow. And I said, why? And they said, because we feel it's such an important area. Now, they were not, one was in bioengineering and the other was in one of the humanities. And they said, and we're interested in becoming maybe setting up an SME in this very space, but an SME for 20-year-olds.
What's an SME?
A small and medium-sized enterprise. So like a small business, an innovative business in this space so that they could harness their interest in aging to create a business opportunity for themselves. That's why they chose Trinity, so that they could access Tilda. And when I mentioned Tilda during the lecture, they came up to me afterwards. So I was really energized by that. And their approach was, what you're talking about suits the middle-aged and older person, but we'd like to reshape it for the 20-year-old. So
I love that.
Isn't it amazing?
I love that. Yeah. So I want to talk about Tilda. You mentioned it. And I'll be honest, growing up, my familiarity with that term was to do with a particular maker, basmati rice, which we would have at home, Tilda basmati rice. I'm sure many people listening will resonate with that. But when you talk about Tilda, you're not talking about a rice brand, are you?
I'm talking about the Irish longitudinal study on aging. That's where the D comes from. There was already the Italian longitudinal study on aging. So we had to recreate it. We couldn't use the S from study.
Let's just understand what that means, right? You say longitudinal. What does longitudinal mean? And I just want a bit of context here. People who've been listening to my show for a while will know very recently I had on Professors Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz, who are the director and associate director of the Harvard Adult Development Study that's been going on now, I think 85 years or more, right? So they're familiar a little bit with that study and some of the learnings from it. So can you explain what your study is? What does longitudinal mean? And how would certain elements of your study compare to what they're doing in Harvard? Okay.
So longitudinal means generally that you have a cohort of people, and in our case in Tilda, it's an Irish population of people aged 50 and older, chosen through a randomly selected sample, which means that whatever findings we get, we can generalize to the population. And the same people are studied longitudinally at regular intervals, in our case, every 2 years. And the study has been running for 16 years now with a 3 to 4 year pilot run-in. So every 2 years, we go back to the same people. Now, That's what the longitudinal bit is. That allows you to understand the process of aging. So you're looking at the same person now for 12, 16 years, as it stands at the moment. You knew what they were like at baseline, and then you can actually look at changes in the components. I call it the tapestry of that individual, which makes up how they are now. For example, we measure a number of different factors. Of course, we measure genetics, the epigenetics, all of those new biomarkers of aging, the common things like you get in a blood screen, your kidney function, your kidney function, your electrolytes. I was going to say urea and electrolytes. I'm so used to saying that when I'm ordering them. Your kidney function, your electrolytes, your hemoglobin, etc. But we also measure social factors and economic factors. And they're really important to understand who we are biologically. So we measure all of those factors. And for example, at age 50, if we had a man who had that broad assessment, including a very detailed health assessment, who had a stroke 16 years later, we can go back and see, okay, what were the things about that man compared to others in the study, which were probably the risk factors at that time, which led him to be a victim to stroke in 16 years.
No, I love that. That's so fascinating, isn't it? I think we can all really get our heads around that if this happens, instead of just looking at what were the blood tests on admission or 6 months before at your GP before you got the stroke, I think there's a growing recognition that these chronic diseases, they don't just happen overnight. The process that's driving them is going on in the body for 10, 20, sometimes maybe 30 years. So I can see the power there that you can go back and go, hey, what was going on when you were 50? And so what are some of those key learnings that you've found so far?
Oh, there's a host of them. Okay, so we've published nearly 600 papers from the study to date. And not only us, we make sure that the data is publicly archived after it's been cleaned, and we've done, analytics on it to make sure that it's kosher. And then it's publicly archived in Ireland, but also in Michigan, so that it's available to universities worldwide. This is a great asset for us because that means that you get researchers all over the world tapping into your data source. So let's say, what have we published so far? So it depends. We carve it into three big domains: social, economic, and health. In the health domain, we found that this won't be a surprise. Metabolic syndrome is very common. It starts early. Metabolic syndrome is where you have a mix of obesity, central obesity particularly, high blood pressure, early diabetic markers, and abnormal lipids in the blood. That cocktail makes you much more at risk for cardiovascular events later on. And
does that cocktail speed up the rate at which you age?
Yes, absolutely it does.
And can we just, Roseanne, if you don't mind, just pause here for a second, because I think we talk about aging a lot, where it's becoming more and more a part of the vernacular, I think. Certainly in my world, the people I communicate with are very health conscious. We're hearing a lot about anti-aging these days. What exactly is going on when we age? Because then I think it'll be helpful if we understand that. So then we can understand, well, metabolic syndrome, which is so common now, how is that influencing those kind of parameters of aging? Okay. So just imagine you have, this very famous image of an iceberg and a threshold, a line going through the iceberg. That's the sea level. And we can see the iceberg at the top. That's your older person. And below that, there's a whole lot of stuff. And below that is the process which has been accumulating for years and years and years of all of the biological biomarkers, we'll talk about those, influenced by the social and economic factors, which eventually lead, in the case we're talking about now, to health diseases or disorders, to a health outcome. So all of that's been going on for many years, as you've said, and then it creeps above the threshold and we get a heart attack or stroke or dementia or whatever. So aging is actually really the manifestation of disorders or diseases that we're
very familiar with, and multiple diseases, because having multiple diseases is not uncommon as we get older. An average of 4 to 5 is common. But the process that we're trying to understand are the earlier stages where it isn't a disease as such, but it will ultimately evolve into one or other disease if something isn't done about it and checked. And that's what we're most interested in. So if we come back to metabolic syndrome, what we're looking at is early physiological changes in blood pressure, that's the hypertension, and in the lipids, fat lipids, triglycerides, cholesterol, etc., and in your waist-hip ratio or obesity markers, and early diabetes, just creeping hemoglobin A1C, and then how they evolve into a disease state. So it might be that you then develop type 2 diabetes, full blast, or kidney disease as a result of atherosclerosis, or a heart attack, etc. But it's the early combination of those. And metabolic syndrome itself is very common in Ireland. 40% of people over the age of 50 have it. It's remarkably common.
40%. Do you know what that figure is in the UK?
Oh, very similar. Yeah,
very similar.
Our data is almost a duplicate of what's
and generally
happening here.
America tends to be a little bit worse than us, doesn't it?
They're fatter and generally sicker than in Ireland and the UK, actually. Yeah.
So if someone listening to this wants to take action on that, right, to go, okay, you've said a few things there about metabolic syndrome.
Yeah.
What can I do now at home? You know, what would you advise? Would you advise them to measure these things, go and see a healthcare professional, find out if they have it? How would you advise people to tackle that?
So I would definitely say we should all know our blood pressure, and we should know it every single year after the age of 40. Know what your blood pressure is, and know what your seated blood pressure and your standing blood pressure is. Because as we get older, we're more likely to get a drop in blood pressure standing, and that actually has to be managed a little bit differently. So know your blood pressure seated and standing every year. Know your lipid profile. And it's not just about cholesterol. It is about triglycerides and HDL, LDL ratios, etc. So know your lipid profile every year, and know your hemoglobin A1C. Hemoglobin A1C is a very good marker for diabetes, obviously, but pending diabetes and pre-diabetes.
Yeah.
And it actually is an indicator of what your glucose has been doing over the last 2 to 3 months. So that's why it's such a good marker. It doesn't shift up and down with the food intake, etc. So at least those 3 things we should all know.
Yeah. So what I like about that's a lot of talk about anti-aging now, and some of the testing that is being spoken about is not widely available to everyone yet, right?
I agree.
Whereas the 3 things you just mentioned, blood pressure, a blood lipid panel, and an HbA1c measurement from your blood, is pretty commonly available. Certainly in the UK, those things are freely available on the NHS, right, to the National Health Service.
Yes.
So they're very accessible things. And so if we just go into those a minute, let's take HbA1c, okay? 2 to 3 month average measurement of our blood sugar.
Yeah.
So one of my frustrations with, I guess, the way the practice of medicine has evolved over the years is that it's become very black or white. And much of the time we interpret things in a very black or white fashion. Mm-hmm. It's either normal, or it's pre-diabetic, or it's diabetic. Right? Type 2 diabetes I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So, if your HbA1c is 6.5 or above, we say type 2 diabetes. If it's between 6 and 6.5, we say that's pre-diabetes. Mm-hmm. But if it's 5.9 or 5.8 or 5.7, it will often be reported as normal. Mm. So I'd love you, with all your knowledge, to expand on what do you like to see with an HbA1c? Of course you want it normal, but are you off the school of thought where lower is better?
So when I started off as a junior doctor with respect to blood pressure, we were treating blood pressure, systolic pressure, if it was more than 160.
No way.
Yes. And now we're looking at 120.
Hold on. So when you qualified, it was 160.
Well, yes.
You were treating. When I qualified, I'm pretty sure it was 140 was the threshold to actually treat.
Yeah. And now we're down to 120.
Yeah.
So, and that's because massive randomized control trials have been done to explore this. So it's the same with all of these. We're talking about biomarkers. Everything we're talking about now are biomarkers. All a biomarker is a marker of your biological status. So all of the biomarkers that we use thresholds because that's where the information is at that particular time. And obviously, it's much easier to apply at a population level. For individuals, it varies. And you know the way there's a distribution at a population level. And of course, people lie outside of a normal distribution, many. And we're learning that same change with respect to blood pressure is applying to a number of other biomarkers, and lower and lower and lower thresholds are being applied.
So if a patient came to see you and their HbA1c comes back at 5.9, so technically it's not yet in the pre-diabetic range, what do you say to them?
I advise them. I give them lifestyle modification advice.
Do you say, look, it's not yet pre-diabetic, but if we don't do something, or if you don't do something, this may very quickly end up at prediabetes?
And that's what we've shown in the study, that it very likely will evolve into prediabetes, even 2 and 3 years later. So get a grip of it now when it's reversible.
Yeah.
And the grip is easy. Grip is low sugar, manage your diet and lose a bit of weight. The grip for that one is very easy.
There's some pretty good data now, I think, showing that all-cause mortality it goes up as your average blood sugar goes up. Yeah. So if we compare, let's say, an HbA1c of 5.9, again, technically normal, with an HbA1c of 5.4, I've seen some good data showing that actually your mortality goes up as that goes up, right?
Yes.
But we're still calling 5.9 normal, which I don't think we should be anymore. And you mentioned something there which I think is really worth expanding on. At a population level versus an individual level, right? I'm not sure everyone fully understands that concept, right? And I think it's an important one because a lot of the time the guidelines we're being given that doctors are applying are things that maybe, let's say in the NHS, have been deemed overall for these 60 plus million people that exist in the country, we can afford to actually manage this percentage of people if we have crossed this threshold, right? So on a population level, it works, but individually, you may miss out, right? Yes. How would you frame it for people?
No, I think you framed that incredibly well. So if you're near the threshold of something, those thresholds have been derived by averages, just to understand that. And so it's a cutoff based on averages. But each side of the average, there is a distribution. And we don't make recommendations based on the lower pieces of that distribution or the lower levels of that distribution. We make it where that cutoff occurred because that's the only way we can apply things at a large scale within a health service. So therefore, when you're dealing with an individual patient, I try to deal with the individual. I give them the evidence. I say, look, these are what the recommendations are. In my opinion, I'm knowing you, I see these potential risk factors, and I actually think if I were you, I would get a handle on these risk factors now when you've plenty of time. It's coming back to the 20-year-olds again. There's lovely data on blood pressure to show that if you have a slightly higher blood pressure, even in your 20s, you're on a higher blood pressure trajectory for the rest of your life. Whereas the lower blood pressure group within that population distribution in your 20s are less inclined to have the higher trajectory. Yeah, those graphs are fascinating.
The whole thing's fascinating. This idea that you mentioned with your Tilda study that you can go back. This is for people above the age of 50. Someone has a stroke, let's say, in their late 60s. Yeah. If they're in your study, you can go back and go, hey, what was going on here?
Yes.
That's incredibly helpful. And yes. I'm really excited to see how this data set builds over the years and what else we're going to learn.
Yeah.
But that's 50 and above. As you just mentioned with the blood pressure there, we can go even further back. We can actually recognize in our 20s, we might be able to pick up stuff in our 20s that indicates what's going to happen when we're 60, 70, 80. So just to finish off on that piece, we started off talking about the advice you would give to a female in their 40s. Then we moved on to the advice that you would give someone potentially in their 70s, recognizing that everyone's an individual and everyone, needs slightly different advice. But stereotypically, if there was a 20-year-old sitting in front of you saying, oh, aging, that's miles away in the future, right? Why do I need to be bothered about that? Or What would you say to a 20-year-old that might make a difference in terms of what they do?
So I would sit them down and I'd show them a great graph from the Dunedin study, which I'll share with you now. So the Dunedin is a different model longitudinal study to ours. It's 1,000 babies born in the same year, studied longitudinally, and they're now in their 50s. And in the Dunedin study, they looked at their whole cohort of 1,000 when they were all aged 38. And at this stage of the study, they had the ability to measure their biological aging, their epigenetic clocks. Okay? So they were able to actually look at their biological clock. And of course, everybody was the same age, had the same chronological clock. In other words, number of candles on their birthday cake. And remarkably, they showed that some people aged 38 were behaving biologically like 28-year-olds. But some, aged 38, were behaving biologically like 48-year-olds. A 20-year distribution in their biological aging, although they were all the same chronological age. That's an amazing study.
And so the practical take-home for someone in their 20s is what?
So the practical take-home is this process starts really early on. Now, you know, the trite thing to say, it probably starts in the womb, but for an individual, that doesn't help. But the process does start in your 20s, and you can do damage in your 20s. When they looked back on the 38-year-olds who had the almost 50-year-old biological aging through the clocks, the factors which drove that accelerated aging were adverse childhood events, you know, traumatic experiences in childhood, depression in childhood, or depression in a household, divorce in a household, or bad behaviors early on in lives, like smoking and alcohol in the participants' lives.
If we just talk about these ACEs for a minute, these adverse childhood experiences, this is something that I've covered on the show many times through the lens of trauma with people like Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, recently with a chap called Dr. Russell Kennedy on anxiety. And we're seeing very clearly for many years now, data on adverse childhood experiences, on how, you know, difficult childhoods, trauma, divorces, you know, abuse, the impacts of those things play out in your adult risk of disease, illness, autoimmune disease, all kinds of things, right? But you're saying it also plays out these emotional factors, or what we consider emotional factors, that also plays out in terms of how quickly we're aging.
Well, you see, because how quickly you're aging is what's driving those diseases later on in life. That's my point. The aging process, all it is the precursor to having one of those diseases. And the pace of that aging process means that you'll have one of those illnesses earlier. That's what aging is.
Professor David Sinclair, who I spoke to maybe 2 or 3 years ago on this podcast, he makes the case in his book that we should consider aging a disease. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I don't entirely agree with that, although I can see that there's some overlap in concepts. There isn't a diagnosis for aging as such. It's a very multifactorial process. It's something that we all will experience in one way or another. It doesn't necessarily lead to a disease outcome that we recognize. So there's some of the reasons that I wouldn't agree with that. But also, as a doctor and knowing busy ED departments, etc., I wouldn't like people to think of aging, for which we've no cure at the moment, is a disease. And when somebody comes in, that they attribute something to aging and we can't do anything about it. I think that patients would lose out.
Yeah, I think the point everyone's trying to make is that the aging process underpins all kinds of diseases that we get later on in life, heart disease, stroke, dementia, cancer, whatever it might be. And so if we can slow down the aging process, we also reduce the risk, or at least delay the onset of many of these diseases. I think most scientists study aging would agree with that. But I think there's a wider point here for me, which I've been thinking a lot about recently. There does appear to now be, I wouldn't call it an obsession necessarily, but the term anti-aging is something that really has got the zeitgeist now, right? People are very excited about anti-aging, reversing aging, all these kind of things. Are we missing something about the human experience? Are we trying to defy something that is fundamentally a part of humanity? You know, we're born, we live for a set period of time, and then we die. I'm delighted to announce that AG1, the daily health drink that has been in my own life for over 6 years now, have updated and improved their formulation based upon the latest science. And to celebrate, they're giving my audience a very special summer offer. Some of the upgrades include more magnesium, which supports muscle function and improves the ability of your nervous system to relax, and also 5 strains of bacteria instead of just 2 to reflect the latest advances in microbiome science. It also contains key nutrients like vitamin C, biotin, niacin, vitamin B6, riboflavin, thiamine, zinc, and folate in bioavailable forms the body can easily and readily utilize, maximizing their potential benefits. Nutrition can often seem really complicated. What diet should we be following? What supplements should we be taking? And I think that's one of the main reasons I really like AG1. They make it really simple for you to be the best version of you. Over 70 ingredients, 1 scoop, once a day for less than a cup of coffee. So if you want to support your health 7 mornings a week, get started with AG1, and right now we have a very special limited time summer offer worth £58, which is around $80 US. To get 10 free travel packs instead of the usual 5 and an awesome welcome kit containing your shaker, scoop and canister with your first subscription, go to drinkag1.com/live more. I know you know all the biology and the blood markers, and you've done all the science of aging, but from a philosophical point of view, what's your perspective on that?
It's a great question. First of all, factually, quality of life gets better as we get older. That's the first thing to say. And this has been shown by many, many studies. In our own study in Tilda, aged 50 upwards, quality of life continued to improve year on year until late 70s. And the factor which actually impacted then on positive quality of life was physical ill health. That was the biggest factor that impacted on quality of life. But the measures that we were using for quality of life, very good tool, didn't get to the same level in the 80-year-olds as it was in 50 until people were 84. So in other words, it went up and it slowly came down, and it was only at age 84 that your quality of life was the same at 50.
So hold on. So
better.
Once you've hit 50, on average,
it gets better.
Your quality of life gets better and doesn't get down to that level until you're 84.
Absolutely.
So you have 34 years of good times.
Maybe longer, because the only factors that were influencing beneficial quality of life, this is on average now, this is at a population level, were physical disability. So not being able to do what you were previously able to do because of arthritis or another physical illness.
Is that the point for you? I think that's the point from your book is not necessarily about trying to live to 150, right?
Yeah.
The message I get from your work is that it's just about how do you make sure you've got that quality of life until you do drop down dead?
Yes. And living independently and having a good quality of life. They should be our 2 metrics for happy lifespan.
So on that then, what are some of the myths that are currently being propagated, would you say, around aging? There's all kinds of talk about living to 150 or 120, 130. You know, what's your take? Well, first of all, are there any myths out there that you'd like to share a different perspective on? And I guess related to that, how old do you think it is possible for a human to live in good health?
Well, for the latter question, I would answer to Jean Calment, who I wrote about in the book. We know, therefore, 126 is feasible, right?
Is that what she lived to?
Yeah, she lived to 126. So that's feasible. I think it was 126 or 122. So we know that can happen. That's the first thing to say. The second thing is that actually longevity is attenuating at the moment. The curve has started to slow down and flatten out in the UK since 2012. And in the US. Now, the attributable reasons for that are disparities in socioeconomic status. That's what most of the researchers in this area would now agree in the UK. And in the US, a dominant feature driving that is younger deaths due to opiates.
Wow.
So, that wonderful linear association between years and lifespan that we've talked about for the last couple of decades seems to be slowing down.
So up until 2012, our longevity was going up.
Oh, in a linear fashion, 2.2 years every 10 years since the 1800s.
So each generation was living longer.
Every generation was living longer. Yeah,
every parent wants a better life for their kids than they had.
Yes.
And I guess you could say a longer life potentially. So that was happening. But in 2012, the graph started to change.
It started to slow down. And particularly noticeable actually in the UK. It hasn't slowed that much in Ireland of interest, but we're behind you in terms of the numbers of people over, the percentage of the population over 65. That may have influenced it slightly. But it hasn't, but in the UK, particularly in the US and some European countries, not Northern European countries of interest. So, and the biggest driver for that is social disparities. I mean, Rongan, when did we ever talk about food banks? Yeah. Now, I mean, it's and now they're part of daily practice throughout the country. So, we never thought we'd see that. A nurse had to go to a food bank to get food. So that's the level of disparity we're seeing in society.
And I know you've studied this as part of the Tilda study.
Yes, we have.
And I know many researchers around the world have also studied this. But when we think about socioeconomic status, we think about income, we think about poverty, what exactly is that doing on a cellular level? How is that affecting the aging process?
I have a colleague, Cathal McCrory, who's actually studying this very thing across the life course and showing the biological, the epigenetic, the clock changes that we're seeing associated with socioeconomic divides. So you've got 5 different groups, say, quintiles of socioeconomic status, and those who are in the lower, the worse socioeconomic status have much accelerated biological clocks. And because of the richness of the data we're collecting, I'm able to say to you today that is the case independent of anything else which might be driving accelerated aging.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Let's just contrast then the lady, I think Jean-Louise Calment, who you wrote about in the book, the French lady who went past 120.
Yeah.
You've written about her in quite a bit of detail, which is, it was just so fascinating reading about her story.
She had a privileged life, and probably all of the components that we have got control of with respect to the aging process, she illustrated throughout her life. That's what I liked about her life. Very positive attitude.
Yeah, I wrote this down. You put in, I mean, it's, as I say, I love your book. I think it's jam-packed full of really practical information. At the time of writing, the record holder for longevity for the human species at 122 years and 164 days is a French woman, Jean-Louise Calment. And, there's many paragraphs on her, but this one I wrote down, and I think this really speaks to what we're talking about with socioeconomic status, which is Jeanne never had to work. She employed servants and led a leisurely lifestyle within upper society, pursuing hobbies such as fencing, cycling, tennis, swimming, roller skating, playing the piano, and making music with friends. In the summer with her husband, she would mountaineer. She enjoyed an idyllic, relatively stress-free and fun-filled life. Now, you can interpret that 2 ways. You can either interpret that and go, okay, wow, that has shown us what is possible. And I can see that the various elements that you write about in your book, a lot of them are there within her story. Or that can be incredibly off-putting to people and go, yeah, all right, for her, my life is completely different to that. No wonder I'm struggling. So how do you make sense of that?
Well, I mean, you're a doctor. I'm a doctor. You sit down in front of somebody, you talk to them about ways of alleviating stress, but that they're finding it hard to make ends meet.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's a terrible problem. So you've just exemplified that issue. I struggle with that. I mean, I know what the facts are. I know what works at a biological level. So now we're going into how important this is at a sociological level, at a societal level. How can we change society to enable all of the things that we know will work? And frankly, everything we're talking about here that individuals can modify, they don't cost money by and large. But you need not to be stressed about how to feed the kids throughout the week at the same time. So one of the things that we've learned from our research certainly is education. That education drives better quality of life, less stress, and higher income in later life if you can achieve that in younger years. So at a societal level, one of the things that we certainly can do is protect education for everybody and ensure education for everybody. So that's one thing. And then I think we need to be mindful of how closely those societal issues are linked to health. And it's only going to cost us long term in the health service if we don't address them.
Well, that's a real frustration about this whole topic and area, is that we're just kicking the can down the road. Each government coming in is just trying to win the next election, right? And they're not thinking about 30 years, 40 years down the line, because they'll be long gone. They won't be in power, by then. And it's a real problem because it's not rocket science to figure out. If you feed your population well, if you provide for them, you make it easier for people, actually, people are going to be healthier. They're going to live better. They're going to put less strain on the health service later on in life. But no one's kind of doing that. But one thing I will say, and I think your book really speaks to this, a lot of the things that people can do to slow down aging are free of charge, right? They are. And I, like you, have worked in areas where people are struggling to make ends meet. And even within that, I can't change the poverty. But if you can really connect with that patient and help them understand how, 10 minutes of meditation or prioritizing 20 minutes with your kids or your partner each day, or it is worth on that Saturday afternoon going and nurturing your relationship with your friends and your family, whatever it might be. Those things make a biological difference. So I guess I'm trying to say is that, yes, we want to change society. We want politicians to get involved and societies to be more equal, less disparity between rich and poor, all those sort of things. But we still, even in an unequal society, yes, it's challenging, but we can help people make better choices, can't we? And
we have to take control of this ourselves. And you've written about this. No matter what, even breathing exercises, anything which will enable de-stressing is very important.
Yeah.
And that only takes a few minutes, a couple of times a day. The other thing I think that we can take control of is community, ensuring community, engaging community, being more engaged in our communities, volunteering. So volunteering will help others who are stressed. And most of the volunteering is now done by people who are coming into their third, fourth, wave of life. And 70% or something is the figure. And they get so much benefit from volunteering. Mental health problems are significantly less. Quality of life is better. And disability is less. We've shown this objectively in people who volunteer. And that's not because they were well enough to volunteer. That's longitudinally, people who do it are less likely to get those negative outcomes. So volunteering is really good, and volunteering gives back to the community, and volunteering may well help to buffer some of the challenges that we've just outlined.
I want to talk about attitudes.
Yeah.
Our attitude towards life. Because if I continue what you wrote about Jean-Louise Calment, you write that she did actually move into a nursing home. I think it was after a fall, aged 110.
Yeah.
But again, some really interesting things there. Even though she was in a nursing home, Calment initially followed a rigorous daily routine. She was woken at 6:45 a.m., started the day with a long prayer at her window. She thanked God for being alive and for the beautiful day that was starting, underscoring her positive attitudes and outlook. Then she sits on her armchair and does gymnastics wearing her stereo headset, right? So this is fascinating. I've got this wonderful image of this 110-year-old lady basically practicing gratitude every morning, right? And, you know, we've touched on gratitude several times on this podcast over the years. There's really good research on gratitudes. It seems as though she naturally had this positive attitude. From what you know, from what you've studied, how important is attitude to the aging process?
Hugely important. That's what I would say. Probably, you know, the most important thing that now it's hard to change your attitude. I mean, attitude is very much about being an optimist or a pessimist, you know, but knowing it's important, people might be able to put more time and effort into creating a positive attitude or being positive or less negative about things. We talk about resilience in the science of aging and what makes some people resilient and others not, and how you perceive yourself aging and your attitude towards your own aging and towards others is a major factor. Again, in the Tilda study, we've measured perceptions of aging or aging attitudes at baseline and obviously follow up. And people who saw themselves as 20 years younger than their age, as I do, actually were physically fitter and mentally, cognitively better, independent of all of the other factors we were able to adjust for 10 years hence. So it matters.
So the phrase, you are as young as you feel, actually has scientific validity.
Yes, it's biologically embedded.
I mean,
absolutely.
It's just fascinating that, you know, I think a lot about, I guess, what might be considered the more softer aspects of health, right? Attitude, our perception, these kind of things. But really, they're not so soft when you start studying them. No. There's actually hard data on them. I spoke a few months ago with someone called Professor Anise Mukherjee. She's, you know, very, very experienced consultant endocrinologist, a women's hormone expert. And in the conversation, which is all about women's hormones and the menopause, I shared with her some research that I came across showing that in societies where they perceive aging as a good thing, they associate it with wisdom, you know, and life experience, people report less menopausal symptoms. Right. So I'm very keen to say, I'm not saying that menopausal symptoms don't exist, nothing like that. I'm well aware that they cause huge amounts of problems for many, many women. But it's fascinating to me that when we have a perception in society that actually aging is a good thing, people report less symptoms. And I think that sort of fits with what you're talking about. So perceptions are internal, okay? They come from ourselves, our personality type, if you like, and factors that have influenced us through our lifespan, through the life course, which make us, but also from society. Then that's a really good point that you've raised. If you're constantly getting negative ageist attitudes from the media or from individuals or whatever, very hard for you to retain a positive attitude and an optimistic attitude when you're being bombarded by, in some cases, subliminal ageism. Now, I think that is changing. I even have seen a change over the last decade. I think it's changing. But that unfortunately during COVID, in the initial stages of COVID, we encountered so much ageism in the policy approaches, the quick fix approaches. We don't need to go into it now, but I mean, you know, the whole approach to people in nursing homes, the whole approach to older people being discharged from hospitals, etc. I mean, a very, very ageist approach. The whole approach to letting people die on their own and not let their families be with them. You know, the whole thing was catastrophic. And the language that was being used by the media at the time, people were being called out because of their age. An 85-year-old woman who had multiple diseases died, etc. Now, they stopped that. And I noticed it change during COVID because of the backlash. In Ireland, we used a term, which is a terrible term, called cocooning. So everybody over the age of 70 was asked to cocoon, which meant that they stayed in their home and didn't engage with anybody. So the subliminal implication of that is you're 70.
society no longer needs you. You aren't of value. It's, you can stay there cocooned, terrible word, and no one will notice the difference at a societal level in terms of your input to society. So it is changing, but and I was very optimistic, and then COVID hit and I saw just this negative attitudes towards aging just enveloping everybody again.
Yeah, I think it's just worth pausing there a little bit, because I really feel strongly that these lockdowns, this social isolation piece has been so toxic for so many people. A couple of sort of points I just mentioned from my perspective. I remember a couple of years ago, maybe after the first or second lockdown, I can't remember when, once the leisure centre had reopened and I went to go and have a swim, I was chatting to the guy at reception who I hadn't seen for about 6 months, and we were just having a bit of a chit chat. And he was just saying, people have changed. He's like, people in their 50s and their 60s and 70s who 6 months previously, he said, would come in bright, chatting, they're now withdrawn. They look older. They're not saying much, right? And this is the impact, of course, there's many things there, worry, fear, anxiety, whatever it might be. But there's no question that isolating people has had really toxic effects. There's no question about that.
Everything you've said, unfortunately, is factually correct. In the Tilda study, the loneliness increased threefold during COVID. So we were able to track that because it's longitudinal. So we knew what the loneliness parameters were that we were measuring before COVID, and it increased threefold, as did depression increase threefold, independent of anything again. And we know from animal studies, if you put a monkey in a cage on its own, because we're gregarious animals, as monkeys are, in a cage on its own, and then biopsy the lymph node, which is the engine house for inflammation and immunity, you can find that the genes in the lymph node are upregulated for inflammation.
Now, I'm a huge fan of Vivo barefoot shoes. I've been wearing them for about 12 years now. And one of the main reasons I love them is because when I'm wearing Vivos, I feel fully connected to the ground beneath my feet. What do we want? We want feet that move naturally. And because Vivos are wide, thin, and flexible, your foot can move in the way that it's meant to. A lot of modern shoes are stiff, they're narrow. They start to manipulate the way your foot functions. Whereas in Vivos, your feet could do what they're meant to do. And that means they help your feet become stronger. There was this trial that showed within 4 months of wearing Vivos, your feet are around 60% stronger. Your feet are your foundation, and when you've got problems in your feet, it goes all the way up the chain. It can go to your ankle, to your knee, to your hip, to your back, and even to your shoulder and neck. And as a doctor, I have seen back pain, hip pain, and knee pain actually start to get better when people start to wear barefoot shoes. To get 20% off your first order, go to vivobarefoot.com/livemore.
And down-regulated for the factors that protect our immune systems. And it's well known with social isolation, you're more likely to get colds and flus and viruses. So there's biology, but it's the long-term toxic effects, because inflammation is probably, if you were to identify one thing that accelerates the aging process and is culpable for or causal for the biological changes, it's inflammation. So I think that the social isolation has indeed caused biological consequences, which may long-term be toxic, but worse again, people are finding it really hard to reconnect. Now, this isn't only older persons. Younger people have also suffered a lot and continue to suffer. So it's something we have to address as individuals, to be aware of it and to reach out as much as possible.
I think, humans are... we're creatures of habit. We get used to new normals very, very quickly. Yeah. And I really think we've been deceived by convenience. right? There is a cost to convenience. It is more convenient to meet up with your friends on Zoom. You don't have to go anywhere.
Yeah.
You just, in your kitchen with your coffee, press join, and you feel you're interacting with them. Now, of course, that can have benefits, particularly for people who live far away, but it ain't the same thing. And I also have seen with so many patients and so many friends, they used to go to classes, whatever it might be, yoga, martial arts, singing. But over the last years, they went on to Zoom and they've never returned back. But that convenience, I think long-term can be toxic.
Yes.
And I don't know how we start reminding people. I keep saying it on the show. I want to try and remind people to go, listen, you want to do 10 minutes of yoga every night on YouTube? Yeah. Great. But still sign up for that weekly class that you used to go to back in 2019.
Because you get so much more from that class, bar the yoga. You get the social engagement. And that is, we have evolved as gregarious animals. We have to do it.
Talking about community, in your book, you wrote in detail, is it Rosetta?
Rosetta, yeah.
And it was truly fascinating. So I wonder if you could talk us through Rosetta and what does that teach us about the power of community and social relationships?
This is a great story, and it was probably the start of the link between social sciences and health. So Rosetta was a small town in northern Italy, and in the 1800s, they needed to emigrate. There wasn't any employment, so they emigrated to a location in the States, in Pennsylvania in the States. They called it Rosetta, the town in the States, and they replicated an awful lot of their lifestyles in Italy in terms of the infrastructure, the way the town was designed, etc. And then more and more from Rosetta, Italy, emigrated to Rosetta in the USA. And a scientist called Stephen Wolfe, he wasn't a scientist, he was actually a gastroenterologist, but he got interested in epidemiology and he was very interested in the brain-gut response and interaction and network. So he had a holiday home near it, and he gave talks to towns and villages nearby. And one night he was speaking in one of the towns, and a GP came up to him, a general practitioner, and said, you're talking about what was the big killer at the time, cardiovascular disease, in men in their mid-40s, 50s in the USA. He said, I'm working in this town. It's one of 2 or 3 towns I work in nearby, and I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing people living well into their 65s and beyond. This is in the 1900s, 1930s and 40s. And he said, I'm definitely seeing something different there than the other towns I'm working in nearby. So Stephen Wolfe didn't just take that as he went with medical students the next summer. They took over the town hall and they did all of the measures we know lead to longevity, because in the interim he'd checked their death rate books and found that, yes, it was true. They seemed to be living longer in Rosetta, and he found no suicides, etc. So they went and they installed themselves in the town hall and started doing blood pressure. They took blood tests for blood glucose at the time, etc. And they couldn't find anything. Then they looked at diet and they couldn't find anything. And I'm sorry to say, but they actually found that they were eating, quite luscious pizzas regularly. And he looked at everything he could think of. Smoking wasn't more common, exercise, there wasn't any difference in all the factors we're talking about. And he was sitting one morning in the town square in Rosetta on a Sunday, outside the church. And the next thing, the church doors opened and everybody piled out of church. But they didn't move from there. They stayed outside the church. And for an hour or two afterwards, they were still there chatting, kids running around, mixing. And he realized that the secret of longevity in Rosetta was Rosetta itself.
Yeah.
And then he started to explore their social engagement, their social networks, their social infrastructure, 3 generations living in one household. For a town of 2,000 civilians at the time, there were 22 different civic societies. People were always doing something. So that was, he got other researchers from his university involved who were interested in social scientists, and they started this whole research field, which is so huge now, of how important sociology is in determining our health.
It's just fascinating, and particularly where you said their diets probably weren't that good because, of course, we're trying to promote healthy lifestyles. But what does that mean? You know, if you could live by yourself and hit all your exercise targets and hit a clean, organic, no sugar diet, sleep 8 hours a night, right? But you didn't have community, you didn't have connections, you know, who would be better off? And I'm inclined more and more to think that social connections are right at the top of the tree.
I believe that. That's why I started when I made my list at the beginning. You asked me what were the top few things, and I said friendship. You know, that's social connection, that's friendship, that's engagement. And we know ourselves, if you've had a good night out, in my case, with the girls, with lots of laughter, and, you know, there'll be a couple of drinks involved, potentially, very likely. The next day you feel so good.
Yeah.
And it's been such a good experience. So we know this. It's intuitive. And yet we need to make an effort, particularly since COVID, to build that now back into our daily routine.
Yeah.
And you come back to your yoga. That's why it's so much better to go to the yoga class and not do yoga on YouTube on your own all of the time.
You write about the blue zones. And, you know, I'm interested, as someone who studies aging, what is it about the blue zones that you like so much? You know, what is it that they can teach us? But what is it that they can't teach us as well?
So certainly from the blue zones, a lot that we've already rehearsed with respect to Rosetta is evident in the blue zones. They're sort of an exaggerated Rosetta in that there's a fantastic community activity. There's a wonderful talk by a social scientist who went to Sardinia, and she was engaging with this man who was over 100. He was in his kitchen, sitting in the corner, and she went to interview him. And she said she didn't get a word in edgeways. There were 3 generations living in the house. And then the way his kitchen was positioned, it was the road outside the house was right beside the kitchen window. So everybody passing would see he was sitting there and they'd hop in to say hello. Some of them he liked, some of them he didn't like. He engaged with them all, but after they were gone, you know, he would say sometimes, can't stand that man or something. But her point was she couldn't get a word in edgeways because there was so much activity in the kitchen. It was like a railway station. And it occurred to her, of course, this is contributing to his longevity. He's constantly being distracted and variety and engaged.
So never been left isolated, never been left alone.
At no stage was he alone.
And for people who've never heard the term blue zones before, perhaps it's worth just giving a top-line overview.
So there are 5 blue zones, and they're important. They're called blue because when they were first identified by the scientists who originally identified them, they marked the zones with a blue marker. So it's no more exciting than that why they're the blue zones. But they're actually in quite disparate areas of the world. I'll tell you where they are. There's Loma Linda in California. It's an Adventist group. And sorry, just to say that underpinning the blue zones is that they have a disproportionately high number of people living to 100 and beyond with good health.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what it is. So Loma Linda, the other one is in Nicoya in Costa Rica. Then you've Sardinia in Italy, and the blue zone, why Sardinia is a blue zone, is people there disproportionately live longer and healthier than mainland Italy, just beside them. Ikaria in Greece, also an island, and Okinawa in Japan. Now, already you'll think, ooh, they're islands, by and large, not all. They're by the sea, and they're all on elevated heights. So they're not at sea level, but they're elevated. Now, the things that they share in common, which scientists now believe have contributed to the exceptional longevity, but healthy longevity, or I've described to you great social engagement and civic engagement, community engagement, but also their diets are pretty much plant-based. That's one thing they share in common. I'm not saying that these are exclusively associated with longevity, but certainly factually they share this in common. Secondly, no processed foods, little or no processed foods, low salt, low sugar in their foods. And they never eat to satiation. And actually, I have a scientist friend, Giovanni, who was working in Sardinia for a while, who's really interested in biological clocks, but he's from mainland Italy. And I asked him, what did you notice different about Sardinia? And he said, they don't deliberately do calorie restriction, but they are calorie restricting, he said, and fasting. They don't deliberately do,
How are they doing that?
They just don't eat as frequently, and they don't fill the plates as much as we do.
I mean, I appreciate this is secondhand now. You were chatting to one of your colleagues who was there.
Yeah.
But is there any more flesh on the bone there? Like, what time were they eating? Did they have smaller plates? Did they finish eating earlier?
So they had smaller plates.
Smaller
plates.
I think that, by the way, it's one of the best hacks you can do to eat less is just have smaller plates.
So they had smaller plates.
You perceive you have more
exactly
just from that.
Yes. Smaller plates, predominantly smaller plates. And very often wouldn't have a full breakfast. Their meal would be a lunch and an evening meal, but neither of those were too heavy in terms of food intake. And then the other things that they had in common were physical activity, as we understand it, was built into their day. It was never called exercise, but they did a lot of walking. They walked everywhere when they needed to do something. I saw a video by one of the original scientists who discovered the blue zones of a woman in her mid-90s chopping firewood. And she had done that every day of her adult life. And she went out the back and
in her mid-90s.
In her mid-90s, chopping firewood. But this was part of her routine, like Jean-Marie Calment. It was part of her routine.
Do you know what I love about that? There's no kind of fitness tracker on her wrist. She's not going, I need to hit this amount of aerobic a week, this amount of strength a week. She's just chopping woods. She's getting cardio. She's getting strength. Her VO2 max is going up. It's and that's the fascinating thing for me about the blue zones. But if we talk about exercise for a minute, clearly physical activity is important, right? And right at the start of this conversation, when I asked you if someone was in their 70s, what would you say to them if they wanted to say, Professor Kenny, how can I slow down aging? How can I make sure I'm as well as I can be when I'm 80 or 90? One of the things you said was to do more, move more.
Yes.
And I know I've heard you talk about that before, and it's something I've become aware of now. I'm in my mid-40s, but I'm realizing that actually movement, I was chatting to people at this family do at the weekends. I was saying one thing I'm realizing, you just cannot get away with not moving. Once you stop moving, it goes downhill very rapidly. And as you get older, you got to move more.
Yes.
And so I'm massively increasing now how much I move. And a lot of this is just, it's not anything flash. It's just walking more, just walking an hour a day and then trying to build that in more and more. But what I find fascinating, particularly as aging is being spoken about and sold to a lot of us in the health space, it's a lot about tracking and hitting various metrics. And this will be good for your strength. This will be good for your heart. This will be good for cardio. And what you see in the blue zones is that no one's measuring a damn thing, right? These guys aren't thinking about, I need to get my resistance in. I need to get my cardio in. What's your perspective on that? Because that's fascinating. That's really, really interesting to me.
So I don't do any tracking or anything because actually, frankly, it would stress me. I think with respect to the blue zones, it was built into their natural day. So for us, how would we do that? Yes, go for a walk, but also when you have to nip down to the shop for groceries, give yourself the extra 10 or 15 minutes to walk down to the shop or get on your bike. I cycle to work all of the time because some days that's my only way of getting any activity into my day. And that is very doable, there are other opportunities. The other thing about the blue zones is they did them in nature. So there was a lot of nature, the sea, obviously, but also a green nature. And I think we underestimate how good nature feels.
There's also, though, purpose to their movement, right? And again, I think really trying to go deeper below physical activity, as you said at the start, right? You were in an Irish television interview talking about diet and exercise, and the TV presenter's like, "Oh, come on!" It's almost boring. People have heard it that many times, right? But we know movement is important, and we're well aware that in Western society now, frankly, in all societies, our jobs are sat down.
Yes.
Right? We're sitting in cars,
Zoom.
we're sitting on sofas, we're on Zooms, right? So it's harder. In the blue zones, I know a lot of them, it's part of life. You have to move to get food. You have to move to get in the garden and pick the vegetables, right? So it's not as if they've necessarily got more willpower than us. It's built into how they function.
Yeah.
But the thing I've been thinking about, Roseanne, is that movement has a purpose to it.
Yes.
Walking to the shops has a purpose to it. Standing on a treadmill, right? Or walking on a treadmill or running on a treadmill. Like if you got someone from a tribe and you put them on a plane and brought them here, can you imagine what they might think looking at someone in a gym in their lycra on a treadmill going, well, yeah, but they're not going anywhere, right? And I guess, look, I get it. I'm not saying there's no purpose to it, but it's quite interesting that the movement has a purpose. That lady in the mid-90s chopping wood, well, that's for a purpose, for the fire.
Yeah.
But we're often doing movement without any purpose. We're trying to meet a very dry public health guideline, 150 minutes of moderate activity a week. Now, I understand we need guidelines, but I just think sometimes they're so dry.
Yeah.
They don't have... I don't think they connect with people.
But you can flip that. Look at your day and say, okay, if I want to build walking or cycling into my day, what is it about my day that I can restructure slightly so it's not, as that fixed interval, but just a liquid part, a fluid part of my day. I've got some people now in the hospital I'm working in who've looked at that and thought, okay, the solution is I'm going to walk 3/4 of my way to work or whatever I can possibly do. Give myself that little bit more time in the morning and make that happen. I'm going to have face-to-face meetings with people rather than Zoom people and make myself go to their office. And okay, it'll take more time. But actually, the face-to-face is good for both of you. You get a much better outcome. I think this face-to-face interview is better than if we did it by Zoom. But also you're getting your so-called activity built into the day. So we can make a difference. Yeah. We can walk to school with the kids in the morning. It is feasible for most of us.
And I think we have to look. I just want to acknowledge that some people I know can't walk anymore. They struggle with movement. They might have an illness. They might have an injury. They might be in a wheelchair. So I want to acknowledge that and make sure we're including them within the conversation. And of course, if one is in a wheelchair, let's say you can move your arms, for example, then there are movements that you can do. In fact, Jean-Louise Calment, as we mentioned, when she was in her nursing home, she did gymnastics every morning. While she was sat on her armchair, she would flex and extend her arms and her hands and then her legs, right? Oh, this is interesting. Nurses noted that she moved faster than other residents who were 30 years younger, right? So that's really, really interesting to me. And I don't know how you do this. I have a few kind of personal movement rules, as it were, which I really try and apply, and I've really tried to apply them even more since I had children. So one of them is I will very, very rarely take a lift or an elevator.
Yeah, me too.
I'm always taking the stairs at the airport. If I do drive to the supermarket, I park the furthest away I can from the entrance rather than the nearest one. And my kids now know. And actually, the great thing is, because the kids keep seeing this and they've seen it for a number of years, and they know, like if we go to the local supermarket and we've parked, we'll always take the stairs there and back with our bags. I think once recently I'd hurt my foot and I was thinking, should I get the lift? I was looking at the lift, and I think it was my son said, "Come on, Daddy, we always take the stairs." And I thought, good. I'm taking the stairs. And so again, trying to flip it to go, where can we in our modern, urbanized, let's say Western lives, how can we put in practices and rules that become our norm? Do you know what I mean? It's what becomes our norm. Whenever I get off a plane, I'm always I've been sat down. Yes. I don't want to take that escalator. No. And honestly, normally I'm the only person on the stairs. I was just going to say
that. We don't think, so they are things we can do that are easy. That's a great way to look at it. And that's looking at your day and saying, okay, anything I can possibly do. I always take the stairs at work rather than the elevator. And it's 6 flights up and I feel great after it. And sometimes I do it 2 or 3 times a day. And that I'm thinking, well, at least I got that much in. So we can build it into our days. It's a mindset. And you said earlier on convenience, and since COVID, particularly with Zoom and convenience, that's all about convenience as well. So it's a different way of looking at convenience and actually flipping it to be to our benefit.
Two things about movement that I'd like your perspective on. One is sarcopenia. The other one is how fast we walk. Can you speak to those two things? Because they're really interesting and super relevant to how we age.
So sarcopenia is a fairly new diagnosis, if you like, or disorder that we've become aware of. And it's an infiltration of skeletal muscles. They're the muscles we use for moving. And it's very much age-related. Much more prevalent than we thought. I mean, in people who don't move much, 70% have this sarcopenia. And what it is, it's fairly toxic to skeletal cells. And actually, sarcopenia is probably underlying what we know of as frailty, because muscles maybe haven't been moved as much as they were moving, because that's how you prevent sarcopenia, by keeping muscles moving, continuously waking up those muscle cells and muscle tissues to keep functioning. And as we get older, they need to be reminded to keep moving.
And is this particularly resistance training, strength training that we're talking about here, or is it just generalized?
It's predominantly strength training.
So why is it, do you think, that we need guidance on strength training, which makes people think about the gym, which is off-putting for many people, yet in the blue zones, from what I understand, the people who are living to 100, 105, 110 aren't really going to the gym.
No, but they're doing strength training because she was chopping wood and they're lifting the crails of fish that they carry in from the sea, etc. And they're going to the stores and walking back with their bags of whatever they're carrying, etc. I mean, strength training it can be part of an aerobic exercise, part of a walking exercise. It doesn't have to be deliberately weightlifting. Again, your analogy of the treadmill was brilliant. Likewise, if they came and saw people lifting heavy things while seated on a very strange chair in a gym, that would have the same probably.
Trying to keep their back straight and in a certain posture, like what are you guys doing? What the
hell is this about? So we can build strength training into our daily routine as well. We just because of the way our society has evolved, we're not really doing strength training that much as part of our day. We buy the wood in the local supermarket and then throw it in the boot of the car and drive home, etc. So that's why we have to focus more on strength training.
It's been eroded everywhere. Like even for those people who engage with online shopping, which is very common these days, right? Which is very time saving, but a lot of online shops now, the driver will bring the shopping in and put it in your kitchen, right? Now, I get it. Not everyone does that. Not everyone has access to that. But it's just another example of how bit by bit, any movement that we did have is just being slowly eroded away.
It comes back to the convenience thing. Everything we're doing is about convenience. But in fact, convenience isn't necessarily what's best for us. So,
do you strength train?
I do.
And
I do weights. I'm one of those people that they'd be shocked at.
When did you start doing weights?
I have always loved the gym.
Oh, have you?
Yeah, I've always loved the gym.
So it wasn't that your research taught you things that you thought, wow, I need to get in the gym.
No,
you were already doing it.
I've always liked the gym. So I've always done the gym, not as frequently during the week when I had younger children, etc. But I've pretty much always done the gym.
Okay, so what in your behaviours has changed on the back of your research?
Right. No.
If anything.
The reveal moment. Oh, it has. It has. Definitely my diet has changed.
Really?
Oh, yes. I absolutely. Like I wouldn't dream of having a bar of chocolate now. I mean, or anything. I really try hard not to have processed foods. Now I will. I clearly have processed foods that I can't help. But generally speaking, my diet has changed an awful lot. I don't eat nearly as much red meat. I eat much more fish and much more vegetables, nuts and seeds, etc., whereas I wouldn't have done that before. So diet, definitely. I've reached out to friends. I was working really hard, focusing on my family, and I hadn't been engaging as much at all. And I've reached out to groups of people that I went to school with, that I went to college with, and we're now all part of different WhatsApp groups. I'm on 4 different WhatsApp groups from my past.
Is that still good, WhatsApp groups?
It's brilliant because now we're meeting up regularly.
Yeah.
So one group meets once a month, another group meets twice a year, whatever. But we're meeting up and it's fantastic. And the thing about meeting up at this stage in your life is, there's no baggage. You have nothing to lose. You're not, it doesn't matter who you are or what you are. You knew this person who, in a time gone by, you shared an awful lot together.
Yeah.
That's so different from anything you'll engage with somebody new now. And it's very precious and very rich. It's a fantastic experience. We have a great laugh. There's a lot of sharing. And if somebody in the group isn't well or whatever, they share that and we bolster them in that. So that's been something different. I don't drink as much. So
we're talking about alcohol.
Alcohol. So I try not to have, I don't drink at all at the moment. And I have very long periods when I won't drink at all.
And how do you find that? You live in Dublin, right?
Yes.
How do you find that socially?
Much more socially acceptable now than it used to be. When I was going to college or as a young doctor, we worked hard and we played hard. That was what we did. I find it socially much more acceptable, particularly with the younger people and younger students and doctors that I'm engaging with. The drinking culture is changing definitely. Now, they may be using other substances, but there's certainly, I think it's more acceptable now for people not to drink.
Well, it was interesting when earlier on, when in our conversation, you mentioned, what you do in your 20s, really can make a difference in terms of how you age. I was thinking back to my days in Edinburgh as a medical student, thinking, I'm not sure much of what I was doing back then was helping my aging. But I guess related to that, one of your other core messages is that it's never too late.
No, it is
It's never too late to make a change. And I think that's a really important message. Can you just speak to that a little bit? Because people may go, oh yeah, in my 20s this happened, or in my 30s and 40s I was a carer. I was really, really stressed. We can still make changes even if we've had maybe some toxic behaviors in the past.
So, okay, I'll approach that in 2 ways. We certainly can make behaviours, and there have been changes that make a difference. There have been studies of patients in wheelchairs, for example, who have started strengthening exercise programs, upper limbs or whatever they can move, and they've had an overall benefit, including a benefit in some of the epigenetic activity by doing that. So that's that cohort. So I use that as an example because people would assume, I think very often that that's not something that you're going to modify, but you can, within the context of whatever your disability, you can modify other beneficial aspects, including sarcopenia. But the second thing is there is a recent study, a randomized control trial, where 4 different interventions were used. One half of the study just carried on as ever, and the other half of the study modified diet, did exercise to 60 to 80%. So whatever they could do maximally, they did it to 60 to 80% for 30 minutes, 5 days a week.
Would that be the equivalent of, let's say, a brisk pace walk?
A brisk pace walk, so you're too breathless to talk.
Got it. So nothing
simple
crazy.
Simple stuff. So they modified diet, and the diet was very much a microbiome focused diet. So lots of diversity, polyphenols, carotenoids, etc., probiotics. And the exercise was as we've discussed, but they also did breathing exercises a few times a day to modify stress and to calm stress. And they also worked with sleep and invoked different measures which would improve sleep. Epigenetic markers were measured at the beginning of the study. That's the biological clocks I was talking about earlier on. And the study lasted for 8 weeks and at the end of the study. And remarkably, I think, in the cases which had these changes, these interventions in the 8 weeks, everybody complied. That was the first thing. They watched compliance very carefully. Epigenetics showed that their aging clocks had reduced by 3.6 years. Isn't that amazing?
Hold on.
In 8 weeks.
Okay. In 8 weeks,
Yeah.
by focusing on small changes in our lifestyle, small changes that are under our control,
Yeah.
they could change their biological aging
Yes.
by over 3 years.
Yes.
In just 8 weeks.
Yes.
That is utterly remarkable.
It is. Now, I don't know whether that would be sustained. I can't imagine it would, because what I'm saying is that there must have been a rapid change over the acute phase while the systems were being rebooted, and then the calibration would kind of
it's
off.
A bit like, I don't know, if you are completely untrained, you don't lift weights or anything, right? And then let's say you go to the gym.
Yeah.
The first 2 weeks, you're going to start seeing muscles popping out everywhere. Your body is going to start adapting very, very quickly. And then that can often start to plateau, unless, of course, you're challenging it in different ways. It's that kind of biological principle, really, isn't it?
Yes, but and there will be further studies to look at it. I mean, they just looked at this 8-week period, but this is the first study to look at an intervention in older male adults like this, which has shown a change in the epigenetic clock. So there will be other studies looking longer term, et cetera, et cetera.
And you mentioned epigenetic clock, right? And if I go back to the start of this conversation where we were discussing that 80% of our aging biology is within our control. So what's going on with the other 20%? Is it genes? And when you say epigenetics, what do you mean?
Okay, great question. So genes are the 20%. Epigenetics are the 80%. So the epigenetics are the dynamic, movable features that are on our genes, which are influenced by the environmental factors we've been talking about, like diet and like exercise and like social engagement, etc. The genes are the fixed DNA, which in animal models we can manipulate and change, but not in humans. So they're the fixed bits. We can't do anything about the genes, but the 80% are epigenetics. So they're methyl groups that are stuck onto the genes that are kind of opening up and closing down and opening up and closing down. And they're giving signals to the cells to produce this protein, to make this energy in the cell, to get the autophagy going, which is the truck that gets rid of the toxins that the energy produces from the cell, etc. So the dynamic piece of the process is what we refer to as epigenetics. And we have a way of measuring that, and that measurement gives us biological aging of the cell. In other words, the vitality of the cell.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So what we can actually do about it. Roseanne, one of the things I really, really liked in your book was in the introduction. I'm just going to read it to you because I think it is so, so key. I never ask a patient their age, but rather base decision-making on an assessment of a person's biological age derived from a traditional physical examination and history. No two 83-year-olds are the same. One can run a marathon and the other is a frail nursing home resident. So making a clinical treatment judgment is very different for each and not related merely to a number.
Yeah.
Now, I think sews together quite a few things that we've been talking about today. How much our perception of aging influences how we age, how quickly we age, but also if I think about as two doctors sitting here having a conversation, we can stereotype patients. How do we report? How do we present case histories, right, to our colleagues? Okay, 58-year-old male, two children, works as an accountant. Stereotype. Literally start to influence how our colleagues are going to hear that story, right? And I think it's really good for all of us to be aware of our biases, right? Because it's like time, right? This is getting quite philosophical now, but it's like time, right? 1 hour of time, yes, we can measure it by a clock, but 1 hour of watching paint dry and 1 hour of having a beautiful conversation with you who's flown over from Dublin to have this conversation with me in my studio, it's a completely different experience. It's the same 1 hour, but you can't really compare those two 1 hours because the experience is so different. And in the same way, this whole thing about asking people how old they are, like more and more, I think it's highly problematic because we're conditioning what we think they should be doing or how much they can do simply from an age. And we all know people in our lives of the same age who are, wildly different, don't we?
Yeah. Your analogy was fantastic there. I can only speak to my own profession, as yours, medicine. I think we're really bad at stereotyping.
Yeah.
And then that's coupled with how we deal with somebody, how we manage their condition, etc., and or how we view their prognosis.
Yeah.
I don't have solutions for that.
Yeah.
I don't know how we step away from that. I say when I'm teaching, I say, don't ask people their age. You make a judgment call on your assessment. And that's really important because that will make the young doctor actually look at how somebody's walking. How often do people actually measure? And I'm always saying, right, so what's their walking like? Well, I didn't get them up or, it was late at night or whatever. But we need to watch people's gait, make judgment calls on objective measures like that rather than age. But I don't have a solution to that.
It's just, I think not everything has a solution for it, but I think for me, the take home is just be aware of it. Just be aware of that bias, not only for a doctor, but when I'm interacting with anyone in my community or friends or their parents, don't just assume that because someone is a certain age that they will want to do certain things or certain things are off limits, for example.
But in that context, it's awfully important to ask people about their past. You get a completely different patient in front of you if you find out what their life was like, what they did. I mean, suddenly it's like a black and white drawing becomes full of color.
Yeah.
And it makes it much easier for you to contextualize your engagement with that person and how you're going to treat them.
Well, that's one of the joys of our job, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's one of the joys of being a doctor is you get this really intimate window into your patients' lives. It's deemed okay in the patient-doctor interaction to open up about things that in other settings wouldn't happen. So I would say that's one of the great privileges of being a medical doctor. You get to experience stuff. And
but we feel so much better. You feel as an individual so much better about having shared that with someone. I mean, that's why I am passionate about medicine, because I think that it affords us opportunities of engagement that I don't think a lot of other professions do, but also passionate about slow medicine. And we're losing that. So tests have become much more sophisticated, much more easily accessible. And very often we don't give enough of time for the patient to tell us what they think is going on. They, by and large, will give us the diagnosis in 90% of cases.
I completely agree. So when I was at medical school in the end of the 1990s, we were told by our professors back then that the history is everything.
Yes.
Right? Or most of it.
Yes.
Right? So what the patient tells you.
Yes.
I've been practicing for over 2 decades. I passionately believe that if you give patients time and space, they will pretty much tell you almost everything that you need to know.
So do I, yeah.
In this era now of, fancy testing, diagnostics, do you still share the same viewpoints?
Oh, I believe that, absolutely. And I'm practicing and that I get virtually everything I need from spending time, but it is time. And particularly with older patients, you have to be prepared to be patient and give the person time. However, it's harder, I find, to share that approach with some of the younger doctors that I'm dealing with because there's an adrenaline rush when you're a young doctor and you want to get the angio done now and see what the vessels look like, So I find it harder and harder to persuade young doctors that honestly you'll get it from the history, because that's not very exciting to them when they've so many other exciting opportunities.
You know, I very much am drawn to the human side of medicine. I very much been drawn to what's the message behind the words of what my patients are saying.
Yes. The other thing that that we should be encouraging, I think, and it falls out from all of this, is intergenerational transfers of knowledge and sharing, so that if you, as doctors, if you give time to the patient to tell their story, you will learn so much. But in life, younger people spending time or having friends who are older, and likewise people who are older having friends who are in younger generations, that's not common anymore. And it was. And I think that's something else that individuals listening to this could make an effort to do, because you'll gain from it.
That's what you see in the blue zones, don't you? That a lot of this intergenerational,
absolutely,
not just where they live, how they socialize and interact. It's not uncommon, from what I understand, for a 20-year-old to be hanging out with a 70-year-old, which has huge benefits for both parties.
Yes, that's right.
On the subject of, continuing what we just said about the kind of things patients open up about when they're talking to their doctor, if the environment is right, if the clinician is being attentive, for example. You've written an entire chapter on sex and intimacy with respect to aging. Now, this is a topic that is not often spoken about. It's a little bit taboo for many people to talk about this. So my first question is, were you nervous when writing it? Why, I guess, did you think it was so important to put this chapter in?
So I wasn't nervous in writing it because I've had a bit of a journey, as it were, with respect to this topic. And the person who opened my eyes to this is a girl called Stacey Landau, who's a professor of gynecology and aging in Chicago. And she is passionate about this area and started writing maybe 2 decades ago with respect to sexual activity and aging. So I'd followed her and her work for some period of time and have become very friendly with her, actually. And I've been really interested in the area. And it's what fascinates me about it is it's almost like it's invisible in society. It's not discussed. And when I became enthusiastic about it at the dinner table, because we always made an effort when the boys were in school to kind of get together and we had an evening meal together, I would say, oh gosh, start talking about something I'd learned about sexuality and aging. And they were, right, Mum, we're gone now. We've eaten. Thank you. We're leaving the table. I don't want any more. No more. I think younger generations find it almost impossible to conceive that there would be sexual activity between older persons. In the Tilda study, 70% of couples are still sexually active. And our mean age now is 68, but that's the data from the first wave of the study. So it's common. It's becoming more discussed. We're becoming more aware of it at a societal level. We as doctors don't talk to patients enough about it. We don't ask patients, would you like to discuss sexual activity on a regular basis? People, I think, find it hard to discuss it on an individual level. So I had no problem writing about it at all, because I'm very enthusiastic about it. And I think it's something that we need to be discussing more. And there are issues with it as people get older. Erectile dysfunction is not uncommon. Now, erectile dysfunction can occur at any age, and probably 1 in 3, as you know from your general practice men, have experienced it at some stage or other. And there's lots and lots of reasons for it. But there are reasons which need to be investigated, even if it's intermittent. And it can be indicative of underlying atherosclerosis, that's thickening of vessels, blood vessels, in older adults. When I say older, people 50 and above. And that needs to be investigated early. That iceberg we talked about, that's the process happening down here below the threshold of the iceberg. It can be managed early.
Yeah, I think that's a very important take home for people that we perhaps haven't spoken about enough on this podcast, which maybe speaks to exactly what you're talking about how taboo this topic is. But I think a lot of people, women and men, don't realize that erectile dysfunction could be an early warning sign that you already have thinning of the blood vessels in your heart. Like the blood vessels exist everywhere. If there's a problem with your erections, there could be a problem in your heart. So if you're having it, you really should get that checked out, particularly if you're 40s, 50s, 60s.
So that's very important to be aware of. That can be an indicator also of early stage diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. So it needs to be. And then for women, vaginal dryness is a huge issue. So some of the reasons why older people don't take part as frequently in sexual activity is because it's painful or uncomfortable, particularly for women. Now, that can be dealt with. So dry mucosal surfaces, we know about dry eyes, dry mouth postmenopausally, but dry vagina, dry vulva is also not uncommon. And it can be dealt with hormone replacement therapy, local hormone therapy, and gels. But there's something that we should be discussing with our patients. And I really think as doctors, for those age groups, we should just ask about it. Have you any problem with? And if there's a problem, that'll open up the discussion.
So how does this relate to aging, right? So let's say a couple want to be intimate and have sex as they're older. Okay, so that's a desire. But in terms of the biology of aging, how does sex and intimacy play a role?
Oh, well, this is really interesting because actually it probably decelerates the aging process. It's really good.
And are you, to get really granular here, are we talking about the act of sex, so intercourse, or are we talking about intimacy? Because intimacy...
Probably both. Because it's the neurohumoral consequences of intimacy probably that predominate in terms of decelerating the aging process, probably through attenuating any inflammation at a cellular level.
Neurohumoral, couple of fancy words there. What does that mean for
neuro is the nerves that are involved, usually autonomic nerves, predominantly sympathetic, so nerves, and humoral are the hormones involved, including oxytocin and the feel-good hormones we know about, endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, etc.
So intimacy helps to slow down the aging process.
Intimacy does. Now, the act of aging itself is equivalent to, I did have the figure in the book, I think it's something like 4 minutes on a treadmill. But it mightn't even be that.
Intimacy.
The act of the actual sexual intercourse, the act of sexual intercourse. So that the added value of that over and above the neurohumoral effects of intimacy is exercise. And you can get that in other ways. So it's probably predominantly the intimacy that is having the beneficial effects.
So if we just take the big picture look, one of the things I think has come through from this conversation, you make it very clear in the introduction in your book that there's no one thing that determines how quick you're going to age or how slow you're going to age. It's a combination of factors, right? There's multiple things. And of course, we all live different lives. So, we can all get there. We can all slow down the aging process, I guess, by doing what we can within the context of our lives. And not everyone is going to be able to do everything. Now, in relation to what we've just been talking about, sex and intimacy, of course, many people will feel that they're not in a relationship, right? Many people may feel that, or they are, let's say, happily married, but both themselves and their partner no longer wish to engage in intercourse, right? So let's just be really clear what we're saying. We're not saying that that's a bad thing necessarily, are we? What's the message there for people?
So the message there for people is, of course, it's individualized. And there are lots of studies to show that there are people who are not sexually intimate, who have very good quality of life and are happy with that status quo. It's only if whatever your situation is causing you worry or stress or unhappiness that it's not good. But if you're getting pleasure from whatever the state, either, being single and not having any sexual intimacy, being in a couple, but not having sexual intimacy, or having intermittent sexual intimacy, it's whatever is making you happy. And as long as it's not stressing you and making you unhappy, that's what's toxic.
Let's talk about sleep. What is the relationship between sleep and aging? And I've got to say, one of the things I really, really enjoyed reading about was these 4 sleep chronotypes.
Oh, yeah. Yes. I reckon I'm a lion. What do you think you are?
I'm definitely a lion.
Okay. Yeah.
From the description in your book, I'm a lion. In fact, do you want to go through those?
I'll go through them. So there are 4 types. There are dolphins, lions, bears, and wolves. And the whole point about this is what's our chronotype? Our chronotype is almost our personality type coupled with our 24-hour circadian rhythm.
Okay.
Now, all of our cells have a 24-hour circadian rhythm, and they're all governed by a central clock in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN. And it basically, every single thing about us is governed by that. So that at night time, when it's dark, different rhythms are turned off and different rhythms are turned on. And then in the daytime, different rhythms turned off and on. That's what's important. Now, our chronotypes, which are our sort of personality types coupled with our rhythm, are roughly divided into 4 groups. There's the dolphins, the lions, the bears, and the wolves. Dolphins struggle to fall asleep, sleep approximately 6 hours, wake up unrefreshed, may experience anxiety, irritability. They're perfectionists. Lions, medium sleep drive, wake up early, lots of energy, little energy at bedtime. I'm almost supine after 9 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah,
I'm
me too.
useless. Optimistic, overachievers, go-getters, health conscious, eat well, take exercise, and they're leaders, right?
Yeah,
well, maybe we're choosing, anyway.
Maybe we like to think of ourselves in this way, but I think...
No, I'm pretty much a lion.
I think I'm a lion.
And then bears, deep sleep at night, rise with the sun, strive to be healthy, team players, hardworking, easy to talk to, and they've good people skills. And then the wolves, I'm married to a wolf, wake up in a haze, groggy in the morning. I recognize that. Energy in the evening. So he's much better in the evenings. Tend to miss breakfast, come alive after dark, creative, pessimistic, moody, comfortable alone. And they're very often the chronotype, which is actually aligned with great creativity. And they're also most likely to be addicted than other sorts of chronotypes. And by that we mean my husband is not, by the way, but by that we mean to alcohol and drugs or gambling behaviors. They're very often wolves in their chronotype. They're just fun chronotypes. They've been shown to be scientifically more or less aligned. And
what benefit is there for us knowing what we are?
So, the point is that all of our society is orientated towards the dolphin, the lion, and the bear. But the poor old wolf finds it really difficult because they come to life later on in the afternoon and the evening. And about 1 in 5 of us, 20%, are wolves to comply with the timetable that society sets, i.e. be in school at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning, come home at 4 o'clock, etc., go to bed early, get up early in the morning. They struggle with that. That's the first thing. The second thing is our chronotypes are very closely aligned to sleep habits, as you can see from the description, also to food intake. So it's important that people who have the latter chronotype we described, the wolves, are aware that they're more likely to get negative health outcomes from negative lifestyle behaviors. And I'm sorry if that sounds miserable, but it's just that they're more likely to overeat, or maybe overdrink. And that's part of their struggle with this imposed clock, which isn't their natural clock. Now you can turn that around, and that's the good news, by bit bringing the clock that you are comfortable with as a wolf into maybe the bear or lion clock. And by doing that, by going to bed consecutive nights 15 minutes earlier. But you have to stick to it. You have to be very rigid with yourself and stick to that until you kind of get more into a natural clock. And that does reset some of the neurohumoral, we're going to come on to again, changes that are very closely aligned with the circadian rhythm.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I think, knowledge is always a good thing, isn't it? And at least knowing our tendencies can be helpful. They can help us realize why certain things are easier for us. I find getting up early a piece of cake.
Yes.
It's no problem. I love doing it. I love getting up. I love getting after the day first thing in the morning. Whereas not everyone in my immediate environment, let me put it like that, is the same, right? Yeah. So, in fact, you raised something really interesting. You're a lion and your husband is a wolf.
Yes.
Is there an issue if our partner is not the same chronotype as us?
Do you know what? Once you understand what's going on and you understand that this is a physiological behavioral thing, it makes it so much easier. And I think that each to his own in that context. And, and as you said, knowledge is very powerful, and understanding it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. I think it's great. I think the thing which you did mention, which I just want to highlight, is that, well, first of all, society is set up in a certain way which makes it easier for certain chronotypes. But one thing I've found very much so is that, yes, there may be a genetic kind of template that you find easier, but some of that is shiftable. You know,
Yes.
If you don't expose yourself to light as much in the evening, if you bring your eating times earlier, if when you see natural daylight in the morning, if you can do that first thing, you know, get up early and expose yourself, you can actually, I wouldn't necessarily say reset, but almost reduce the effects. Like I know there's some studies, I spoke to Professor Sachin Panda about this, who's done a lot of the time-restricted eating research at the Salk Institute in California.
Yeah.
You know, he spoke to me about a study where they took people camping without electronic devices, and how it's amazing how so much of what we think our natural bedtime is actually is due to our lifestyles, it's due to our light exposure, at what time we're eating caffeine, at what time we're eating our evening meals. Whereas if you go camping without electronic light, you know, you're just exposed in nature to natural light, you're eating earlier. Actually, our bedtimes are often quite different. Our natural bedtimes are often quite different from what we think.
Yeah, absolutely. So that nucleus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it is linked directly to the eye, and it responds most strongly to exposure to darkness or to light. And remember, it is the mother clock that sets all the other clocks in our cells. So if we are retuning it, if you like, by exposure to light first thing in the morning and then darkness at night, that will help greatly, because that clock is what's attuned to your chronotypes. I cite a very famous Irish Gaelic footballer, actually, in his 90s. And when I was chatting to him one day, I asked him about his day, and he gets up first thing in the morning and he goes outside and takes the air. He just goes outside every single morning and gets some real natural light. Natural light is very important. Then the corollary of that is to help with sleep, make sure your room is really dark.
Yeah.
Because that's how our biology is responding.
It's basic stuff that I think needs re-emphasizing time and time again, because we hear this stuff all the time, right? But if hearing it once meant that we would change our behavior, well, I wouldn't have a podcast. You know, I wouldn't be writing books. You wouldn't be writing your book. It's like, if we just heard it once, your diet and movement is important, and we did it, there would be no need for us to keep talking about these messages around the world.
So I'm going to put a challenge to you now, right? So the other big thing is blue light. That's really bad for that suprachiasmatic nucleus. And certainly I am guilty of this at night. I'll just check for 1 minute my email or my text messages just before I go to bed, right? Before I go to sleep. And you get on, and then an hour later, you're still trawling through something. You have just exposed your poor old nucleus to all of that blue light immediately before it's supposed to switch off all your systems and allow the systems which kick in to get rid of toxins in the brain to kick in. Blue light is really bad, and we should try to abstain from it for about an hour before going to bed. I mean, we've evolved with familiarity with yellow light, fires, etc., and yellow light bulbs until very recently. Blue light is very new to us. The wavelength of blue light is not good for that nucleus in terms of the circadian rhythms. So if possible, we should try to, and that's something else I've changed, that behavior, is not looking at anything on a computer or on my phone for about an hour before I go to bed.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's so difficult for people to do. they're so addictive, these devices.
Well, I went to a meeting in Barcelona recently, a cardiology meeting. I was leaving very early in the morning, like 4:30, leaving the house in the taxi, almost at Dublin Airport. And I thought, oh gosh, my phone. I've forgotten my phone. There was no way I could go back for it. I had my laptop. So for 4 days, I had no phone. I was wearing one of those Garmin devices as part of an experiment that one of my research students was doing. And my mean heart rate went down from 74 during the day to 66 because I had no phone.
Okay.
And I was able to, in the evenings after the meeting, go home and log on to my emails and do it. But I was in control. I was making the choices there. I didn't have any tanging or pinging or light alerts in the background. And that just shows how much, I didn't realize it before this, but how much impact that was having on my cardiovascular system.
That is absolutely incredible. I'd love to see that done on a wider trial because I just don't think we realize the insidious nature, the way being on the entire time has crept in where it is now the norm for so many of us.
Yes.
For me, one of the most powerful things I can do for my health, if and when I remember to do it, and I've got to say at the moment I'm being really good with it, is I charge my phone in my kitchen.
Yeah.
So I live in a house, I leave it downstairs, it doesn't enter my bedroom.
Yeah.
So by not entering my bedroom, it's automatically, the friction there to actually go and get it is huge. It's just not going to happen. Whereas if it's there,
yes,
it is very hard for people to resist. And of course, when people say it's my alarm clock, it's always like, alarm clocks you can get for about $5 on Amazon.
Yes.
Or wherever, your secondhand charity shop, whatever it might be, right? You can get them.
Yeah.
I'm always looking with patients and myself for what are the kind of one-time behaviors, that the kind of upstream behaviors I can do that automatically downstream change things. And I think not bringing your phone into your bedroom, if you can, is such a powerful way of doing that, where you're not going to be looking at blue light, you're not going to be looking at your email, you're not going to be getting caught up on Twitter and something. But of course, people find it hard to do. And I also want to acknowledge that some people need to be on call for certain things.
Yeah.
Sick family members, whatever it might be. The way I tackle that, because that is something that is real in my life, is I have a landline and I've got a mobile. And now I know a lot of people these days don't have landlines anymore. I do. And only immediate family have my landline number.
Yes.
So therefore I can put my mobile phone off and I know if someone in my immediate family needs me, there's an emergency, they can get me.
Yes.
And so again, I don't want to say that's for everyone. I share that in case there's anything in there that's helpful for someone. But these are small things that make a massive difference.
They're tiny things, but it's awfully hard to do. I panicked when I realized I didn't have the phone. And by the end of the 4 days, I kind of thought, do I really have to pick up my phone again? And within 24 hours, I was right back there. And I really noticed it this time, the pinging and the background constancy of it and the expectations by others that I was available. It's a terrible pressure that we're putting on ourselves.
When we talk about the biology of aging and slowing it down, what exactly does sleep do?
Sleep is very important. I'm tentative about saying this because if people are poor sleepers and you emphasize how important sleep is, one thing you don't want to do is make people more anxious about the fact that they're not sleeping. So when we're talking about this, we'll also talk about solutions, hopefully, that might help people. Sleep is very important. 7 to 9 hours sleep is what is recommended as we get older. Now our clocks, our biological clocks, not our biological clocks, our chronotropic clocks change as we get older. So we don't sleep as much with age. So that might be an issue. But sleep is the time when our bodies get a chance to get rid of all of the toxins. It's a time when our brain gets a chance to consolidate the memories we've learned during the day and to store them in long-term memory. It's a recharging period. It was thought that our brains were dormant or almost dead during sleep. But then once we had EEG, we realized that actually it's the most active period for our brains in the 24-hour cycle. It's working really hard to get rid of toxins, to be refreshed and ready for the next day. And people who have shorter sleep are more likely to get cognitive impairment and dementia in the longitudinal studies, and they're more likely to have inflammatory consequences like poor immune responses to viruses or indeed cardiovascular disease. So sleep is very, very important.
So, like it's always hard with sleep, isn't it? As you say, there will be people with young families, young children who are struggling, and often they can hear that and go, oh man, I'm sleep deprived, I'm knackered, what can I do? I'm going to speed up the rate at which my biological clock ages. And I think we have to acknowledge that. We have to recognize that it is tough. It's really tough for adults, for many adults now who don't have help around them.
Or night shift workers. People who have to work at night. I mean, the evidence that night shift is not good for your health is quite strong. But we have to have workforces who work at night. We've worked at night for a significant proportion of our lives. So
what are your top tips then for people?
So what can we do about it? Exercise during the day helps. Okay, but not immediately before you go to bed, because what exercise does is it triggers your whole autonomic nervous system. It gets it all lively and active and awake, and it's going to be awake when you're going to bed. Try and have a chilling period for a period of time, maybe an hour before you go to bed. Read a book or do something to de-stress. Meditate if possible. Make sure the room is dark. We've said that before. Some people find a hot bath or a hot shower helps before sleep. There are foods which are not good, and there are foods which help. So any foods which contain tyramine is a precursor to noradrenaline. Noradrenaline is one of the transmitters involved in the sympathetic system, and that's the fight or flight system. So any foods which contain tyramine will keep you awake at night.
And what are those foods?
They are like blue cheeses, dark cheeses, preserved meats, bolognese sauce, anything with additives in it like that, they're not good. Foods which contain tryptophan, which is one of the proteins involved with serotonin, which is a relaxing, if you like, compound, are good. And that would be foods such as cottage cheese, almonds, the teas we know about, believe it or not, fatty fish like salmon. There was a great study in 95 men in each cohort where they ate salmon before going to bed 3 times a week versus a group who just ate the same equivalent of protein but taking different meats with it. And the salmon eaters, their sleep improved over a period, significantly over a short period of time. So omega oils, they help.
So that's essentially saying for that particular group that was studied, eating fish in preference to meat, if people are choosing to consume animal protein, you're saying fish seems to be better in terms of promoting good sleep as opposed to meat in the evening.
Yeah, and I've given a whole list. There's quite a large list of things which help. And the other thing to be aware of is foods that are high in fiber may impact on sleep at night because they just require more activity from the gut to break down the foods. So there are things for people to be aware of. And if there are some technologies now which are emerging, and you've probably discussed this on your show before, which may help some people, and they're worth trying. Pink noise, white noise. What they do is they influence the rhythm of the brain waves during sleep. The non-rapid eye movement waves and the rapid eye movement waves, and may help. And there are also technologies which actually marry the noise with the different slow waves, which is what you want to get more slow wave activity, which may be of benefit. They've been shown to be of benefit in some studies and not of benefit in other studies. So my own take on that is this could be very individualized, but definitely, I think, worth trying.
And for those people who are in that stage of life where, let's say, they're struggling, for example, young parents, young kids, they're not sleeping particularly well at the moment. In terms of a message of hope for them, let's say you go through 3 or 4 years of sleep deprivation whilst your kids are young. It's certainly something that I did, my wife did, right? how detrimental is that? Or is it just one of those things that happens in life at a particular time, but as soon as you are able to, and if you can get back on track with your sleep, then like from an aging perspective, is that okay? Does it
well,
get back
first
to
of all,
normal?
the vast majority of people do get back on track to whatever their normal sleep rhythm is. That's the first thing. And secondly, there's very little evidence that that period of time has a negative impact, particularly on longer term consequences on the aging process.
I think a lot of the core messaging in your book and from your research is that it's not about the one-off things. It's about what are you doing, 80% of the time, by and large,
exactly.
Month after month, year after year. Is that a fair reflection?
No, that's a very fair reflection. It's about consistency, and it's the long game. Particularly if you start the game early.
Yeah, I got to say we've been chatting for a long time, and there's so much more to talk about. You really have written a wonderful book, Age Proof. It's so succinct. It's full of science and research, but it's also very, very practical. So I can see why it's proven so popular with people. I did want to cover this. I'm not sure we got a time to go into it in detail, but there's one chapter on purpose and laughter, which is really interesting. Any kind of top line thoughts on those two things you want to share?
Well, first of all, laughter is really important. And we know this intuitively because we feel good after it, but it releases a whole lot of neurohormones, which are very important for us. And there's actually used therapeutically now. I'll just cite one study, which I find amazing, is that people who had a heart attack, who were exposed to laughter therapy, were 48% less likely to get a recurrence of a heart attack. Now, that's a massive figure. So that's the benefit. So just carry that moment and know that laughter matters. Laughter is a way of us to bond socially. So it's all tied up with this whole social engagement piece.
It plays into what you said about friendships before.
Yeah,
like if
absolutely.
I think about hanging out with my best mates, what do we do? Well, we do lots, but one thing we're always doing is laughing when we're together, right? So, again, that speaks to everything, that they're not all in isolation. They all of these behaviors
absolutely
kind of
interact. And kids laugh 400 times a day. There are studies to show this. Toddlers laugh 400 times a day, but we laugh so much less as we get older. So let's introduce laughter as part of it.
So laughter really is the best
medicine. And then purpose. Purpose is terribly important. And actually, my message about that is anything can have purpose. If making a shopping list and go down to the shop to get the stuff, that's purpose. You can create purpose in your day. We need to feel purpose. If we feel we have no purpose or almost unwanted or unnecessary, and we come back to this whole concept of social isolation of people over 70 and cocooning people over a certain age, if we feel we have nothing to contribute, we have no purpose, that's really bad for us from a physiological perspective.
Yeah, one of the things in that chapter I particularly liked, and it's something you just echoed now, is that you can find purpose in anything. It really makes me think of what we were saying about attitude.
Yeah.
Right? Like, going to get the shopping can be seen as a chore. Oh man, I've got to go and get the shopping now, or whatever it might be. But you can actively reframe that. Maybe a bit of gratitude, maybe a bit of, oh wow, I get to go and actually get the food now that feeds my family or feeds me and my partner, or whatever it might be.
Yes.
And I know it sounds very soft and very simple. I honestly believe that you can train yourself to have this attitude. You can train yourself to look at the positive side of everything, even washing the dishes.
And purpose is tied into control. And we need to be in control. There are lots of studies showing that in an employment hierarchy, those who are in control, that is one of the most important contributors to good health in those individuals compared to those who maybe are often in the bottom of the hierarchical chain and have no control. They have to do what they're told, etc. So purpose is part of that. Purpose, if you can reframe it, gives you control over your life. It is your purpose, and you're framing what your purpose is. Therefore, you're in control. And that's really good for us biologically.
Yeah, I love that. I got to say, I've so enjoyed our conversation. I enjoyed meeting you a few months ago at the book festival and speaking with you and having all our panel discussions. I've really enjoyed reading the book. Just to finish off, what would your top tips be for people to say, Professor, I want to slow down the rate at which I age. What can I do?
I would say build an even stronger friendship group. Keep moving and move a little bit more every year, not less, more every year. And be cautious about your diet.
Love it. Thanks for coming on the show. If you enjoyed that conversation, I think you are really going to enjoy this one about what and when to eat for longevity.
This is probably the most effective diet that's ever been promoted on the planet. This protects our body against decay, disease, and the root causes of aging. It's not only good for you, but will make you live longer.